Okay, so this is a continuation of our discussion last time. And last time we discussed about the different types of disasters that the Philippines faces. So you have earthquakes, you have typhoons, you have volcanic eruptions, and so on. But before we proceed to our National Disaster Risk Reduction Plan and what the government is doing as a response, let's distinguish first between disasters as well as extreme weather events. So, this is very important because not every extreme weather event, like a typhoon, would actually cause a disaster. And so disasters only occur when certain events cause serious disruption in the function of a society because it has caused widespread human, material, economic, or environmental loss. So if you have typhoons, for example, na wala namang namatay or wala namang na-damage, then it's not really a disaster. It's just a typhoon, right? So you have certain key concepts that will help you understand when a specific hazard, like an extreme weather event or a typhoon, could lead to a disaster. You have two key elements. You have the hazard, so anything that could lead to danger in society. And as you could see in the picture, these includes fires, this includes volcanic eruption, typhoons, and some of them are not natural, like the fire, and some of them are natural. Anything that could cause danger to human lives is a hazard. Uh, Anyways, and then you also have vulnerability. So any weakness in society that could make that hazard worse and lead to really bad effects or consequences. And then if you combine these two, you have a hazard and then you have a very vulnerable society, then you get a disaster. But not all countries have this kind of problem, right? Depending on if they have less vulnerability. So you have a hazard like an earthquake. If you have designed buildings that are earthquake resistant or earthquake proof, then obviously there's not going to be a disaster happening in this situation because there's no damage to the building and there's really no human cost to the people. So you do not have any disasters. And so, as said before, the Philippines is an example of a country that is prone to a lot of hazards because it is in the Pacific Ring of Fire. Okay, and you also have Japan, and you also have countries to the west. So you have the US, right, and parts of South America as well. But some of these countries are more vulnerable because they have more vulnerabilities with regards to the hazards itself. So they're more likely to feel yung mga consequences of the hazards. And to sort of try to understand this concept better, we introduce the concept of disaster risk. This is or could be explained through a simple equation. You have hazard times vulnerability over capacity of societal system. So disaster risk is a combination of the interactions of natural hazard, vulnerability, as well as capacity. It uses the simple concepts that you have learned in mathematics, right? When you have a numerator that is more than your denominator, and it's a very big number, you will get a higher amount, right? So, for example, mataas yung hazard natin, mataas yung vulnerability natin. Siyempre, yung disaster risk natin also mataas. But if we actually make our capacity bigger, then it will also decrease disaster risk, right? So, if your denominator is bigger, then it will lead to decreased result for disaster risk. Again, hazard means any phenomenon that has the potential to cause damage to human beings and their livelihoods. And vulnerability means the characteristic and circumstance of a community, system, or asset that makes it susceptible to damaging effects of the hazard. Okay, so how do you minimize disaster risk? You try to decrease your hazards, you decrease vulnerability, your numerators, and then you increase the capacity. But there's a problem or there's an issue with that. So there's no way to decrease hazards for now because hindi natin mapaprevent or wala tayong way para makontrol yung typhoons, earthquakes, and so on. It's impossible. But we could decrease vulnerability, right? So decrease the weaknesses in society by being more prepared, right? Making sure that a community is or you know what sort of hazards are in the community in the first place so that you could prepare for them. And then you increase the capacity as well. So you design infrastructures, solutions that could make disasters less likely to occur in the future. So you have examples here. Any weakness, for example, lack of public information and awareness, is obviously a vulnerability, right? And this could lead to really bad consequences, specifically in disasters or in hazards na kailangan talaga crucial yung pag-deliver ng information, right? Because this is where people depend on what to do with regards to their actions. Dun sila kukuha ng parang guidance. Okay, so we really need to have this kind of capacity. For example, yung vulnerability is lack of public information and awareness. If you have a good system for informing the public and making the public aware with regards to disasters or hazards, then it's gonna be a societal capacity. Again, any strength of a community is societal capacity, while any weakness is a vulnerability. Storm is obviously a hazard. And then you also have good knowledge system for hazards. For example, you have pag-asa, which is the capacity. Okay, so I hope you understand this because this will sort of explain the approach of our government with regards to disasters. So before, yung approach natin sa disasters is just response. What does this mean? Every time nagkakaroon ng disasters, dun lang nag-act yung government kapag tapos na. So, magbibigay ng ayuda, so on and so forth. But in 2010, the Philippines decided, and even before that, there were already efforts to do so. Um, the Philippines, however, created a comprehensive plan with regards to disasters. So, hindi lang response yung kinakailangan. You have to prevent, you have to mitigate, you have to prepare the people, respond, and then you have to have recovery afterwards. So, it's a four-part plan to make sure that disasters are lessened in the Philippines. The government council that was created to supervise this is the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, and it's composed of many government agencies. Okay, I'm sorry, hindi siya nakalagay dito, pero ayun, that's the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. I don't know why it didn't appear in the PowerPoint. Ayan. Anyways, you have the Republic Act 10121. This is the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010. And they acknowledge, or this act acknowledges, na hindi kailangan dapat nakadepende lang sa national government yung pag-respond sa disasters. So they know if you map out the Philippines, there are some risks and hazards that communities or some communities are more vulnerable to kasi iba-iba yung ating composition ng place natin. So some areas are more prone to earthquakes, to landslide, and so on. So kailangan ng mas local na approach with regards to planning for disasters. That's why they give the LGUs the power to monitor, to get information, to prepare for the disasters that their local community is facing. So you have local community disaster risk reduction plans because this is the most practical and most reasonable way to approach disasters. Okay, so they give LGUs power to use 70% of their calamity funds for risk reduction. That's before the disaster happens. So, trying to strengthen the capacity of their communities as well as to decrease the vulnerability of their communities to disasters, and 30% for immediate response activities. And this is composed of four parts. Ayan. So, you have disaster prevention and mitigation. The point here, this is the first part, avoid hazards and mitigate their potential impacts by reducing vulnerabilities and exposure and enhancing capacities of communities. So, ito yung pinakauna. And later on, we will look at what government agencies is part of this. But usually, this is to gather knowledge, what specific risks or vulnerabilities a community has, and so on. And you also have disaster preparedness. So this one has to do with preparing the people and the community to what to do in cases a specific weather event or a hazard occurs. And so establish and strengthen capacities of communities to anticipate, cope, and recover from the negative impacts of emergency occurrences and disasters. And you also have disaster response. This is what happens immediately after a disaster strikes. Ayan. Later on, you will see kung bakit nagsasabi ako immediate. Kasi yung disaster rehabilitation and recovery, this one is more long term. Anyways, yung response, eto yung afterwards. Ayan. So, making sure that people are safe, right? Giving interventions with regards to mental health, to physical health, to injuries, as well as looking at people who are missing or uh, recovering the dead and so on and so forth. Ayan. So this is immediately after disaster, what government agencies jobs are immediately after disaster. And then you have rehabilitation and recovery. So this one is to try to uh, minimize as well as address whatever consequences the disasters has. Trying to make sure that the people who were affected recover after the disaster, that the buildings that were destroyed and infrastructure that were destroyed get maintained as well as get fixed. And also, not only that, but also to try to make our infrastructures, our capacities better as well so that it will be able to withstand future disasters. And so these are some brief summaries of what aspects or what elements or components compose our national disaster risk reduction plan. The point here is to have safer, adaptive, and resilient or disaster resilient Filipino communities towards sustainable development. Ayan. Again, eto siya, oh, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council. And this is composed of four. Okay, so just get this or look at this. Again, ano yung part ng ating NDRRMC or the plan where we avoid hazard, reduce vulnerability and exposure, and enhance societal capacity. So I'll give you 5 seconds to answer this. Ayan. Okay, so this is disaster prevention and mitigation. Okay, and then you also have strengthen communities' capacities to anticipate, cope, and recover from the negative impacts of disasters. Okay, sorry, this should be disaster rehabilitation and recovery. I'm sorry. And so this should be orange. Provide life preservation and meet the needs of the affected population based on adequate standards during or after disasters. So yung immediate means disaster response. Restore and improve the facilities' livelihood and living conditions as well as the capacities of affected communities. Anything that has to do with restoring is rehab and recovery. And with regards to the lead agency, we have the DOST, Department of Science and Technology, because they're in charge of monitoring as well as getting information or data with regards to disasters. You also have support agencies like DNR, DPWH, Department of Finance, Office of Civil Defense. Okay, this will not be part of your quiz. I just want to introduce to you uh, more comprehensively the plan. Ayan. So, kung sino yung gumagalaw kapag nagkakaroon ng disasters. And again, hindi siya kasali sa ating quiz. Okay. You also have the lead agencies. These are the DILG for disaster preparedness. So, sila yung nagpre-prepare sa mga communities natin. Nagkakaroon ng mga simulations. For example, kapag nag-earthquake drills kayo, yung nag-organize dyan is the local government. And kapag nagkakaroon ng mga briefings with regards to the evacuation sites that people should go to in case there's a typhoon and so on, or the protocols that people should observe in cases of specific hazards, then it's the DILG. Okay, so you also have the Philippine Information Agency. okay, for disaster preparedness, because it has to do with information dissemination, right? So, for example, magkakaroon ng typhoon, right? So, pag-disseminate the information is a key part of disaster preparedness. And you also have the Office of Civil Defense. And then you also have disaster response. So, yung talaga na bibigay ng serbisyo is the DSWD as well as the DOH. DOH usually has to do with physical health as well as mental health din. DSWD has to do with making sure that people get relief or immediately relief during or after the typhoon in the form of food, shelter, and so on. Yeah. And you also have disaster rehab. This should be orange. I'm so sorry. You have NEDA, the National Economic Development Agencies, and the support agencies for this are the National Housing Authority, 'di ba? Kapag may damages sa bahay, DOH, as well as the Department of Public Works and Highways. Again, so the point here, the reason why I'm explaining this to you is so that you just understand the key components of the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. So no need really to memorize the specific agencies, but just so that you're familiar kung ano yung ginagawa nila. Okay, just scan through this. Disaster response, obviously, this is after disasters. Mental trauma, surveyed and new infrastructure is built. I hope you understand why the specific parts of or responses are categorized in their specific categories. Ayan. Okay, so, ayan. How are LGUs preparing for disasters? By making sure that you have contingency plans. Contingency plans are plans that outline what to do in cases of certain situations. For example, there's an earthquake, ano yung gagawin ng community, and so on. You also have improving early warning systems as well as evacuations. You have organizing volunteers and disaster responders, ensuring LGU has enough funds to actually commit to all of these things that they're supposed to do, as well as working with local partners, right, with regards to information dissemination, warning systems, and also checking facilities. Okay, so we move on to the key part of our lesson. We have this one. Okay, so you have aggregate and general long-term change in weather elements. Currently, this type of change is a long-term increase in the Earth's average temperature, known as global warming. Ayan, so this is obviously climate change. So I'll just show you the map first. So this is a very old map. I think it was created 1950s, and it shows the specific seasons or sort of climate types in the Philippines. So obviously not hindi pare-pareho or hindi homogeneous yung ating climate sa buong Pilipinas. Ay some parts of the Philippines get more wet season and some part of the Philippines get more dry season. And so you see the yellow ones, these are the ones that are usually hit by the typhoon. So usually they're rainy all year round. And usually wala silang dry season. You have um, number one, yung sa left side, they have dry seasons from November to April, and the rest of the year they're wet. Ayan. So these are just specific areas and what type of weather are expected or what type of climate, right, is expected of them throughout the years. Okay, when we're talking about climate change, usually we're using it in the context of the increase, right, in temperature, yung pag-change ng climate because of increases in temperature. So these ones is a graph um, which shows specific uh, statistics that certain agencies have collected. So you have three agencies there. Ayan. So you have Merged Land Ocean Surface Temperature Analysis, the MLOST. And you have the HADCRUT, that's the Hadley Center Research Unit. And then you also have the Goddard Institute, that's GISS, Goddard Institute for Space Studies Surface Temperature Analysis. And you could see, diba, from the statistics that more or less pare-pareho yung findings nila. So they are all complementary with regards to their findings. Walang masyadong variation. But at the same time, nakikita natin sa graph na grabe yung pag-increase ng temperature throughout the years. So, nakikita natin there's a certain um, pagbaba at pagtaas. Pero the trend, right, from 1960s or 1900s actually papunta sa 2000s is just tumataas yung temperature. So, there are certain fluctuations, but the general trend is that tumataas yung temperatures natin. 'Di ba? Okay, so with regards to this, there is data that shows that from 1880 to 2012, the temperature of the land and ocean all over the world has increased by 0.85 degrees Celsius to 0.89 degrees Celsius. So these are certain indicators, right? So 1 degree Celsius yung pag-increase ng average temperatures from those areas. And our scientists today are projecting that mag-increase yan mas mabilis. Okay, and we know why. Ayan. So, I think in your science classes, it was already told to you why the climate or why global warming exists. Pero before, it used to be a long history with regards to um, how to sort of correlate kung ano yung nagko-cause ng pag-warm ng globe. Ayan. So you had scientists who had to try to study and to prove that okay, it's human activities that actually makes the climate change. Ayan. So this scientist, for example, si Charles Keeling, this is the scientist who was the first one to establish a connection between the rise of the Earth's temperature and the level of carbon dioxide in the Philippines. Talking about direct correlation, di ba? Kapag tumataas yung carbon dioxide, then tumataas yung temperature ng Earth. So, he recorded this from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And then you also have scientists that recorded the data in the ice cores in Antarctica. And you could see, 'di ba? Nakikita natin tumataas talaga yung ating kapag tumataas yung CO2 natin, tumataas din yung temperatura natin. So the blue line here is temperatures. Even though there's deviation, the trend is that tumataas siya. So carbon dioxide was increasing annually because of the fossil fuels. And they knew this because of statistics from the International Energy Administration. Again, alam natin that carbon, or when we're using up fossil fuels like petroleum, gasoline, and so on, all of these products that we use for our cars, for our factories, coal, for our industries, all of them produce carbon emissions when we burn them. Yeah. So we could see that statistically tumataas talaga yung ating temperatures since 1998. And the reason for this is what we call the greenhouse effect. Ayan. So the greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon, and we actually need this because this is what keeps the temperature of the earth warm enough so that it could actually have human beings and our sort of our our life forms be able to live in this place. Ayan, kapag walang greenhouse gases, the earth would be too cold to live in and we would die. So kailangan siya. But the reason why this is such a problem right now is because masyadong marami tayong mga greenhouse gases. Right? We have an excess of greenhouse gases to the point that the earth is warming or could warm so much so that we could not be able to survive anymore. And so there's a problem with regards to this. So the warming of the earth is done through greenhouse gases such as water vapor, methane, and carbon dioxide. But since greenhouse gases continue to increase due to human causes, and so human causes includes this one, our factories, hindi lang factories natin, lahat ng mga practices natin. So, kapag nagle-live tayo sa bahay, when we consume stuff, we use up a lot of energy, right? And that energy comes usually from fossil fuels because very few people use renewable energy right now. Ayan. So, nakadepende yung ating buong ekonomiya, ating buong society sa paggamit ng fossil fuels, which contributes greatly to climate change. Okay, I forgot to download this one. Ayan, I want to show this to you first. Um, okay, so this is actually a really big file. The reason why I didn't put that in my PowerPoint is baka mag-crash yung PowerPoint ko. Uh, anyways, if you want to look at this article, it's a really good article. It shows the 9 tipping points that could be triggered by climate change. When we're talking about tipping points, these are certain unreversible events na kapag, para siyang domino effect, na kapag tutumbahin mo yung isang domino sa start, talagang matutumba din yung iba. Ayan, hindi na siya mababalik, 'di ba? And then, when that happens, then talagang magkakascade. Okay. Hindi na talaga tayo, it's not gonna be the same anymore. So there will be changes and these changes will be disastrous to human beings. So for example, kapag magmelt yung ice sa Arctic, like, or sa Greenland, that took hundreds or thousands of years to develop yung ice doon. Obviously, there's no way to bring back that ice, right? And that ice supports a lot of, like it makes sure na the water levels don't rise and so on and so forth. And you also have other factors as well. So just read this if you're interested. And so medyo ano siya, hindi kaya ng internet ko for now. Ayan. Anyways, let's proceed to the greenhouse gases and human activities. So if you look here, there's a cycle with regards to how carbon dioxide is maintained, as well as, or how the balance with regards to our carbon dioxide budget is maintained by the environment. Okay, so you have carbon dioxide emissions coming from the fossil fuels as well as the industries. If you burn those specific minerals or fossil fuels, then obviously carbon would be emitted into the atmosphere. Ayan, you have all of these things, all of the human activities that lead to carbon emissions. You also have this one, so land conversion or land use change also emits carbon dioxide. So these are the top emitters of carbon dioxide and other fossil fuels. Okay, but there's also regulation coming in from the environment. So you have sinks, land sinks, right? So the plants actually absorb carbon dioxide, right? So they regulate, kumukuha sila. And then you also have ocean sinks. So the ocean also absorbs carbon dioxide, but this is not enough. Hindi siya enough to absorb the amount of carbon emissions that is being spewed by the environment, by the human environment. So 7 billion plus na mga tao that contributes to all of this, and we only have so much trees, we only have so much plants in the ocean or the ocean itself to regulate the carbon emissions that we're actually spewing. Ayan. So this is a very dangerous, walang equilibrium na nangyayari. And hindi lang carbon dioxide yung pinispew, pero you also have methane, water vapor, hindi lang ganun, pero you also have man-made gases that were created due to the Industrial Revolution, such as hydrofluorocarbons and sulfur fluoride, nitrous oxide, which are a new breed of greenhouse gases. And so, very dangerous situation to have. Okay, ano yung consequences ng ganitong klase na sistema? And so, let's look here. You have impact on water resources. So, yung impact on water resources, iba-iba yan. Depende sa country or sa location ng lugar. there are areas where rainfall is projected to increase, and there are areas where rainfall is projected to decrease. So, in certain areas of Africa and subtropical areas, you have a projected decrease in the quantity and quality of water, therefore affecting forestry, agriculture, health, as well as human settlement. Okay, so this means that when we're talking about water, we're talking about fresh water here. Yung ginagamit para pandilig sa mga halaman. Okay, so kapag mas likely magkaroon ng drought, right? There's also higher irrigation demand kasi there's a higher evaporation rate. So mas kailangan ng mas maraming tubig kapag masyadong mainit. Hindi enough yung current levels of water supply nila. Hindi lang 'yon. Pero kapag nagkakaroon ng climate change, there's also a possibility na magkakaroon ng saltwater intrusion. So, yung groundwater mo dati na fresh pa, right? Hindi siya saline na pwede mong gamitin na pandilig sa mga halaman mo. Pwede siyang ma-infuse ng salt water. That is not really ideal and hindi makaka-inhabit yung mga plants mo dito. Yan. So, it will really strain the resources of the environment. At hindi lang yun ha, kasi yung mga tao din in these places really need water as well. So the solutions for this is that in areas in Africa, for example, or Egypt, they're trying to make sure that they have enough water reserves. Ayan. So, gumagawa sila ng mga infrastructures like dams, reservoirs, so that they would collect water during rainy season. And then, meron silang parang spare na water na itatalaga kapag nagkakaroon sila ng drought. Sa Pilipinas, we have certain uh, years because of La Nina, kung saan nagkakaroon tayo ng drought. And then you also have certain years kung saan mas dominant yung stormy weather natin through La Nina. So may ganun ding trends sa ibang places. Sometimes we're gonna experience severe droughts and sometimes we're gonna experience severe rainstorms. So kapag dalawa, 'di ba? Jackpot. Dalawa yung problema mo. Ayan. So you have other another way is increase as well in rainfall. So there will be flooding events with mud and landslide that will have a huge effect on public infrastructure. Ayan. If you could see here, the Philippines is actually very prone to flooding because of what we have enumerated before, right? When we talked about floods, our human waterways are blocked. Our river levels our rivers are silted and so on. Ayan. And there's a lot of rainfall that's brought about by typhoons and so on. You also have impact of forestry and agriculture or impact on forestry and agriculture because of the increases in temperature and rain. So areas in middle to higher latitudes will have longer seasons, which would benefit them, while tropical and subtropical areas would have decreased agriculture tied to severe droughts and cyclones and effects on water supply. The extinction rates of species will lead to decrease in ecosystem stability. Okay, so again, there are some countries that will benefit more from climate change, and then there will be countries that will also be devastated by climate change. If there's a lot of drought and there's a lot of cyclones in your country, obviously your agricultural sector will suffer. But for example, here, ayan, you could see this graph. You have northern or countries in the northern latitude which contribute the most to CO2 because they're the ones that are developed. And then you also have subtropical countries, which are the ones that are developing or undeveloped pa. But with regards to high vulnerability, ayan, look at the impacts. So, yung mga hindi nagko-contribute masyado sa CO2 emissions, sila pa yung grabe yung impacts. Actually, the countries in the north could actually benefit more from climate change. Ayan. Paano? So, for example, sa Greenland, dati before climate change, there's such an icy region na they're basically useless, uninhabitable sila. But if the ice melts, right, then it would be an ideal place for people to live in, right? So you have lots of mineral reserves in Greenland. Actually, now, nung nagbe-melt na yung ice, they're trying to drill oil already, and ang rami nilang oil na nakukuha. Aside from that, you could actually have agricultural effects also. Pwede ka na mag-plant, pwede ka nang, magiging habitable place na siya. Russia also is benefiting from climate change because, di ba dati, for example, Siberia, very cold places becomes warm, become more habitable, become more likely to be pwedeng malagyan ng agriculture and so on. And actually, yung kanilang waterways that were full of ice before, uh, ngayon nagme-melt na. So, pwede na nilang madaanan, which makes trade even faster for them. So, grabe yung benefits. You actually have a lot of billionaires already who are buying land at Greenland because they know that in the future, uh, magkakaroon ng problema with regards to or they know which places are desirable already. So, it's actually real estate na. Ayun. Mas magiging valuable yung mga places na ganito. And syempre, yung mga places kung saan magsisink or grabe yung effects ng rise and sea levels, hindi na sila magiging habitable. And usually, these places would be on or contained sa Asia. Yan. Coastal cities like Hong Kong and Shanghai would probably not be habitable anymore by that time when the sea levels rise. So, walang real estate dyan. It's not profitable at all. Pupunta yan sila sa iba't ibang mga places kung saan mataas yung elevation at doon mamamalagi. So, habang ngayon, kahit ice pa lang yung Greenland, wala pang masyadong infrastructures doon, wala pang masyadong tao, bumibili na kaagad sila ng mga lupa, right? In anticipation for climate change effects. Ayan. And next one, you also have impacts on coastal resources because of sea level rise. Sorry. The Philippines' extensive coastal resources faces a lot of risks, which include disappearance of low-lying islands, erosion of beaches and cliffs, coastal communities, exposure to storm surges, stress on fishing opportunities because of the impact on marine ecosystems, loss of productive agricultural land as well. Okay, sorry. Ayan, so, syempre, obvious, kapag tataas yung sea level, you'll have disappearing beaches, coastal areas, as well as cliffs and the low-lying islands. Actually, it's already happening in some places in the Pacific right now. So, their islands are disappearing. Nakikita natin to, grabe na yung pag-penetrate ng tubig sa mga places where they live in. Ayan. And this actually created a new breed of refugees known as climate change refugees. So yung mga people sa specific islands of the Pacific like Vanuatu, for example, lumalabas na sila or nagma-migrate na sila to other places kasi uninhabitable na yung kanilang mga islands because of climate change. Ayan. And you could see here, in 2050, it's projected that Manila or parts of Manila would already be submerged. Yan. Anong parte? Intramuros, Paco, Manila, Manila Ocean Park, yung embassy ng United States. Ayan. Yung mga basilica, ayan, Tondo will be submerged already. If this trend continues, kapag walang magbabago with regards to how we approach climate change, we still continue on with our consumption patterns, our production patterns, hindi magde-decrease yung CO2 emissions natin, then this would be very likely to happen. Yan. Hindi lang yon, pero our resources, our marine resources will also be affected. So fishes, if nakikita nila na uninhabitable na yung kanilang environment, kasi 'di ba kapag tumataas yung sea level tapos very acidic na yung tubig natin, for example, magkakaroon sila ng problems with their habitats because, di ba, the corals are bleached, yung shellfish also, their growth is stunted or lessened, and so on. Wala na silang habitats, their sources of food also would decrease, so they'd go to other parts of the ocean. Ayan, yung fishermen natin kawawa. Pupunta yan sila sa may Greenland or whatever kung saan medyo maganda yung um, kanilang environment or ecology, kung saan they have enough food, they have enough habitats, and so on, and they'll evacuate from the places that are not ideal na for them. Ayan. You also have health impacts because of the increases in temperature as well as rain. You have higher outbreaks and spread of water-based diseases, leading to higher mortality rates, increased pulmonary diseases. Ayan, it has to do with lungs among children, and also increased cardiovascular diseases among the old. You have increased health risk from poor aerial quality in urban areas. And because of the uncertain food supply coming in from risky or from uncertain agriculture yields, then you could also have the possibility of malnutrition. Ayan. So if you remember, in Africa, malnutrition rates are also already very high. And when this is heightened again by climate change, you can just imagine the sort of impact that would have kung mas grabe pa or mas gaano pa karami yung mga tao na magkakaroon ng ganitong problema. So these are the specific impacts. And diarrheal disease. If you don't know, people die from diarrhea there. Yun. So because they do not have enough hydration, nawawalan sila ng tubig, um, do not enough food, they do not have enough rest as well as food so that they could recover, and so on. You also have environmental degradation because the environment will be degraded. People will be forced to evacuate. They have no source of food, they have no source of water or supplies, and this will lead to trends in migration, 'di ba? And because people migrate to another place, usually that place would not be so welcoming to these refugees. So there will be conflict happening in these societies. You have extreme heat leading to heat strokes and other cardiovascular failures. You have severe weather. You have air pollution leading to cardiovascular diseases as well as asthma. Changes in vector ecology. When talking about vector, these are certain or diseases, vector diseases are certain diseases caused by parasites as well as insects like mosquitoes. So the kinds of diseases that would be common because of climate change or because of global warming would include malaria, dengue, so on. And you also have increased allergens, water quality impacts leading to more diseases, and effects on public health such as cholera, leptospirosis, and so on. Okay, so this is a summary of everything. Okay, just read through this. What is the government and what is the international government or international organizations and intergovernmental organizations doing to remedy this climate change? Ayan. So in 1995, they organized a convention of parties. Nagagather dito lahat ng countries to discuss climate change. So the first one was in Berlin, and the third one was in Kyoto, Japan, 1997. Okay. And the reason why I mentioned this is because sa Kyoto, Japan, dito sila nagkaroon ng parang iconic na document that actually uh, is still being talked about today sa climate as or having a very big impact with regards to climate change policies. Ayan, so with regards to this is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Ayan, ito yung mga conventions nila. So currently, we are in the 26th Convention, 2020. Yun. This is an agreement. You have 20 conventions all in all. This is an agreement by countries to limit the increase in climate temperature. Through this, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. So this one is 1997. Kyoto Protocol because they met at Kyoto, Japan, or the world leaders met at Kyoto, Japan, as well as the Paris Convention to limit the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And 1.5 degrees is such a key number. This is what the scientists have forwarded as a key target for all the countries. Okay, dapat daw hindi tataas sa 1.5 degrees yung increase ng temperature natin. Yun yung key target natin. Later on, we'll look at this kung bakit sinasabi nila yon. Okay, so the highlights of the Kyoto Protocol, the agreement of industrialized countries to lower overall emissions from six greenhouse gases, targeting 6% to 10% reduction. And you also have carbon credits and carbon buying. Ayan. When we're talking about carbon credits, kapag um, or carbon buying pala. Kapag for example, ikaw China, tapos tumaas yung ano mo, like nag-agree ka na i-reduce yung carbon dioxide emission mo by 6%, right? And then what happened is hindi ka nakaano, you failed that target. So, for example, 4% lang yung nabawasan mo or nakuha mo. And then, Denmark managed to do their target 12%. Ayan. So, tumaas yung kanilang pag-lessen ng carbon emissions. You could buy that specific percentage, right, from Denmark, for example. Ayun. Or pwede kang magbigay or mag-allot ng or mag-extend ng mas maraming carbon by buying extra carbon from other countries. Parang ganon. So, yung Denmark kapag they have increased or decreased pala their carbon emissions, and you are a country that has still a lot of carbon emissions and you cannot hit the target, right? You buy from the country which has exceeded the target itself. Ayan. So, parang nangungutang ka. You're trying to buy the space that is allotted for that country. Yan. Anyways, this is an incentive also na, okay, this is very costly yung pag ayaw natin na ganito na lang palagi ang gagawin natin. So, obviously, it would actually incentivize them to look for cleaner energy sources para lumiit yung kanilang carbon emissions para hindi na sila magbayad sa ibang bansa. Ayun, that is the uh, strategy or sort of the thought or idea behind that. Ayan, and you have the Paris Protocol. So this one was agreed on by when Obama was in office. Ayan, so this was in 2015, just before President Trump was elected. Eto yung kanilang dapat holding the increase in the global temperature well below 2% or 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Ayan. Rich countries will provide a minimum of $100 billion to develop ones or to developing ones for climate change adaptation by 2020. Ito yung kanilang policy. 196 countries adopted the agreement. Okay. This will come into force by 2020 if signed by 55 countries covering 55% of global emissions. Climate neutrality by 2050. The balance between the emissions as well as the sinks, you have your ocean sinks and forest sinks or land sinks, should be reached in the second half of the 21st century. And there's also an agreement to speed up clean tech development and international technology transfer, and it also binds countries to save and increase their forest areas in order to capture the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And you also define climate loss and damage terms, but liability and compensation are not mentioned. We're talking about liability, kung ano yung responsibility ng mga countries that have emitted a lot of carbon emissions and what their responsibility are to the countries that have suffered the effects of their carbon emission uh, the global warming because of the carbon emissions that they have emitted in the first place. Ayan. So, nakikita natin last time, 'di ba, na yung mga subtropical countries, sila yung pinaka-konti na ni-release na carbon sa atmosphere, pero sila yung nagsasuffer disproportionately. So, um, this protocol is suggesting that the countries that are actually contributing more to carbon emissions should pay the countries that are suffering because of global warming, which is caused by the carbon emissions from these countries or from these developed countries. Ayan. And what happened is Trump withdrew from this agreement. So hindi siya hindi siya nag-sign. But okay, so people or countries were really really disappointed and actually angry with Trump with regards to this. Nung una, 'di ba, $100 billion, okay, lahat-lahat ng mga countries na rich, so Japan, China, Russia, US, all of these developed countries are supposed to pay 100 billion. With regards to this, $3 billion yung, or $3 billion yung ipipay ng US sana, or uh, at the first year. But what happened was, when Obama was replaced by Trump, okay, they did not agree to this. So they withdrew their support. Pero fortunately, you have China, which is still there. And China is the biggest emitter with regards to carbon dioxide. The second one is US. Okay, so we really hate Trump. Ayan. Nakakainis siya. Okay, so he doesn't really care about what will happen to these countries. Anyways, ayan. Just so you know how hard it was to prove that climate change is caused by human activities, the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had to produce five assessment reports from 1990 to 2013 para lang magbigay ng conclusion na human activities cause climate change. They are 99% sure. Yan, most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid 20th century is very likely 90% confidence due to the observed increase in anthropogenic or human-caused greenhouse gas concentrations. Sa fifth, tumaas, 95% confidence. Ayun. Sa sixth, dapat 99% confidence na. 97%. Okay. So our responses to climate change include RA 9729, and this law created the Climate Change Commission. This is the Climate Change Act of 2009, which is the lead institution that oversees and evaluates government programs on climate change and makes sure that the national government and LGUs are working together for climate resilience. Tingnan nyo to, oh. Crop damage hit 6 billion pesos. This is just for 1 year. You have state of calamities, lakes, wallows, villages, typhoon coming. Um, be sure, or it's sure that certain headlines like this would dominate our pages in the future. And this is the organization structure of the Climate Change Commission. So the head or the chairperson is Rodrigo Roa Duterte, the president. Ayan. And it is composed of different agencies that will coordinate and synchronize and evaluate the climate change programs of the country, including the Department of Agriculture, syempre, for the agricultural sector, Department of Energy, syempre for prevention and making sure that we're trying to shift or transition to clean energy, DepEd for educational purposes with regards to climate change, DFA, DILG, DND, and the RMC, DPWH, I'm so sorry for the typos, DOST, DTI, DSWD, DICT, NEDA, among others. Ayan. So this is the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change. Yung processes that drives climate change includes energy, transport, land use, change, and forestry, agriculture, and waste. And they're trying to make sure that this is um, resilient or climate risk resilient. Yeah, so they're trying to shift to strategies for energy, transport, and forestry and agriculture and wastage that contribute less to climate change. Ayan. So we have the effects, the impacts, and vulnerabilities. And trying to make sure that development is sustainable and takes into account environmental effects. Okay, so you have mitigation. These are strategies to try to address immediately or to work towards addressing immediately yung ating mga suliranin dito. So, energy efficiency and conservation, diba? That's strategy for our consumers. Make sure that, and producers as well, renewable energy or shifting to renewable energy, environmentally sustainable transport, infrastructure, waste management. Okay. You also have adaptation, so ecosystem-based management, climate-responsive agriculture, water governance and management. Eto yung adaptation. This is what happens when it's already the problem is already there and it's much worse na. So you just adapt, okay, with the current situation that you are having already. And so climate proofing of infrastructure and so on. Ito yung mga policies that has to do with climate change. Ayan. Anyways, the most important policies to remember are yung Climate Change Act of 2009 as well as the National Disaster Risk Reduction Act of 2010. Ayon. Climate Change Commission policies for 2018 includes policy review on energy. So, evaluating the energy sources of the Philippines and trying to shift to renewable energy, creating of the Blue Carbon Steering Committee and the Blue Carbon Technical Working Group of the Philippines. So actually, developed countries are giving us devices to try to track and monitor the carbon emissions that we are having. I think Japan has given us some technologies to do so. Ayan. I also have resolution mandating the integration of indigenous peoples practices. Ayan. So, because indigenous peoples are the first people to actually survive right in their environment. Sila yung may pinakamatagal na historic knowledge kung paano mag-survive sa environment, and they have preserved this kind of knowledge throughout the years kasi hindi nagbabago yung kultura nila. It's a really good idea to look at the practices that these humans uh, whose cultures have been preserved for thousands of years. Yan, nakasurvive sila eh. So dun tayo sangguni sa kanila. And then you have comprehensive integrated climate adaptation and resilience program, water summits, as well as greenhouse gas inventory. And you could see here, ito yung mga places sa Pilipinas na magkakaroon ng mga specific na mga problema. Ayan. So, for example, dito sa my region, this one, sorry, hindi pala by region. Anyway, sa my red na part, it's very prone to sea level rise. So, parts of Iloilo. And then dito, sa atin din, yung may yellow na part. Okay, actually, dito tayo sa may red na part. Ayan, sea level rise. We're prone to that. Ayan, baka lulubog yung Boracay. We don't know. Okay, so you also have trends in dealing with climate change. Okay, some people, some institutions are developing new technologies to try to address climate change. So some scientists are trying to find ways to solve climate change outside of making policies. Instead, they're trying out inventions. And you also have suing major carbon emitters. Ayan. So some Pacific islands have already sued the countries that have emitted the most carbons and so on. Ayan. We end our presentation here.